Players podcast. I'm Frusile. Thank you so much for joining me. If this is your first time joining me, the philosophy of this podcast is to speak to the players who are shaping the metagame so that their voices can be heard. Generally, that has meant speaking with players who have won the challenge or have developed a new strategy and found their way into a challenge top 8. But this week's voice is Alexandre Weber. He plays online as against, and against all odds. He was a back-to-back-to-back champion of the most prestigious Pauper tournament in the world. And despite English not being his first language, he has so generously agreed to come on the podcast so that we all have the opportunity to learn more about that. Please do enjoy. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast this week. Could you tell me a bit about yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Alexandre, I am 25 years old and I'm a Pauper player from the south of Brazil. I have a YouTube channel called Magic Matters, and for 3 times in a row, I was the Brazilian Pauper Champion.
Now, how did you get started playing the game of Magic the Gathering?
Okay, so I started playing Magic when I was 8 years old. I remember playing on the street with my neighbors without any sleeves, and also we had no clues about the rules of Magic, and it was somewhere between Mirrodin and Onslaught.
Okay, so how did you get into Pauper, and what made you stay with it?
So I started playing Pauper in 2015. I remember saying to my mom that if she paid me for the pre-release of Shards of Alara, I would never play Magic again. And I kept that promise for many years. But eventually I came back to MTG, and the first format they told me was Pauper. And I fell in love with the format. Basically because of 3 elements. The first of them was because it had regular tournaments in the local game stores I could go to. The second thing was the fact that when I started, almost every Pauper player had the same level of knowledge to the game. So everyone by that time was starting playing Magic tournaments. And because of this, we could grow together as players. And the last thing, of course, was the price. That fits really well what I could afford, and it also fits really nice with the country's economy. And I stayed in the format for the exact same reason I started. Players from the same level, growing in the game together. Also the format was always getting more and more competitive and challenging. So basically, as I was getting better, the format had always a different challenge for me to do. And another thing that's great about Pauper is the community. I made many friends from the game, initially players from the city I live, but after some time, I made some friends from different states of Brazil, and recently, I found out that the MTGO Pauper community is also great and very receptive. So Pauper has a huge importance in my social life, and it will remain that way.
Okay, so I have some questions about the Brazilian National Championship. Now, my understanding is that this is not an open event where you can just show up and play. Rather, this is one that you have to qualify for. Could you explain what that qualification process looks like?
Yeah, the event isn't open, but it isn't so hard to qualify. Basically, you have the whole year to qualify because the finals are usually on November or December. From what I know, there's a guy responsible for the finals, and the local game stores from Brazil can contact him in order to make a limited number of qualifiers per year. Usually, every qualifier gives you 1 spot on the finals for the winner, but every LGS, local game store, is allowed to make 1 bigger event per year that gives more spots on the finals and a bye for the winner. And also, everyone that plays a qualifier needs to contribute to the finals prize pool. It is something close to $2. In the end, the total prize pool gets close to $3,000 every year, and the prize is mainly for the top 8, but there is a smaller cash prize for the top 32. This is usually the procedure with game stores, but some place doesn't have a game store, or maybe the LGS from the region doesn't want to make a qualifier. So the players can also contact the ones responsible for the finals to make an independent qualifier. The finals until now were always in São Paulo, which is the most populous city from Brazil, but as I said, I live on the south of the country, so only a few players from my city travel to São Paulo to play the finals because the travel can get a little expensive.
Very interesting. Now, I understand that you played 3 different decks for your 3 different wins. What were they, and what would you have played if you had been able to compete in the championship this year?
And about the 3 times I end up winning the tournament, the first time I played Burn, it was a really messy metagame because by that time you could only play with cards printed as common physically. So cards like Hymn to Turek and Sinkhole were legal, and at the same time Peregrine Drake was legal, so it was a clash of titans between Mono Black Devotion and Izzet Drake. I remember playing for Guerrilla Tactics in my sideboard just because I'm Hymn to Turek, and it worked. The second time in 2017 I played Affinity. It was the year I started to play MTGO, and I was doing really well with the deck on MTGO leagues. Nothing close to Carve's level or anything like that, but a good number of 5-0s and 4-1s. And this amount of practice on MTGO translated to a win on the tournament. And the last year I played Boros Bully, so basically the story behind the deck was that one day after Pauperganda made the first result with the deck, which was a 3rd place on the challenge, I started playing a lot with the deck one day after. I also remember that after some time, James Stone decided to put Palace Sentinels on the build, and then the deck felt really well-rounded and complete. On the tournament, Boros Bully was clearly the best deck in the format, and no one in Brazil thought the deck was good before I win, which is crazy to think about. A fun fact is that this tournament was 1 week after the release of Ultimate Masters, so foil got downshifted, but it was early to say if the card was good or not. So only a few players knew that Dimir Delver was actually the broken deck of the format and not Boros Bully. And I took advantage from that uncertainty with a precise deck choice. So this year I would have played Boros Bully again, because I was playing a lot with the deck when Archon's Astrolabe was still legal, and after the banning I didn't have time to practice with anything else. And despite being the deck of my choice, I don't think the deck is in a good spot right now, so I probably wouldn't top 8 this year. For the ones that want to know why I didn't play this event, it was because I had to do an emergency surgery one day before the tournament.
I think that Guerrilla Tactics tech is pretty spicy, and it sounds like it worked out quite well. Could you tell me how you prepare for Nationals each year?
I can divide my preparation in 2 parts. One of them is the practice, in order to know what I need to do in every situation of the game, and the second part is thinking a lot how the meta will be and what is going through people's minds. For example, trying to understand which is the common sense from what is bad or good, because sometimes it is important to play something that most people think it's bad, and only you, or maybe just a few people, know the deck is actually good.
You mentioned a hefty prize for the winner. Is that 3,000 USD? Or is that Brazilian currency?
Yeah, the price of $3,000, as I said before, was an approximation, because in reality it was $10,500 of the Brazilian currency. But it was just an approximation I made, not a precise one, to be honest.
Well, that is a sizable prize, from my understanding. But what about the bragging rights? How are you perceived in your country as a player?
Yeah, things were getting bigger and bigger every time as I kept winning the Pauper Nationals. And to me, it was a strange feeling, because I was always really shy. So I never wanted the attention to me, and because of the way I am, I don't usually say I was the champion to anyone. But at the same time, I am a YouTuber, so I kinda need people to know what I won, and it is a conflict in my personality. Because on one side, I am shy and I don't want the attention, but on the other hand, I kinda need to brag just a tiny bit, because I'm somewhat of a public person and I need to work a little bit on my image. And yeah, in Brazil, most pauper players from the country know me, but I don't know exactly how I am perceived. But I try to be as accessible as I can, so people can know that I'm just like everyone else.
Now, you mentioned that you would have played Boros Bully, which is what you used to qualify for the Format Championship with. What does qualifying for the Format Championship mean to you?
Bully is certainly one of my favorite decks. I think it's a solid deck for a live tournament, as long as you can play really fast, especially on the first 3 rounds of the tournament. Because if you draw early, you are probably facing a lot of Thrones, Boros Mirrors, and Ores of Pestilence. So that was my strategy. play really fast, and have a lot of aggro decks in my pairings. And about the Pauper Championship, I am very excited to play that tournament, and I need to see how many Tron players will be there to see if it's safe to play Bully. And with this new Mystic Sanctuary metagame, Boros Bully can be a good choice, as long as you have a good sideboard against blue decks.
You've been playing for a while now. What has your favorite Pauper deck been?
My first favorite deck was Bird, but nowadays I don't like the fact that every Bird build is basically the same. So today I think it's Boros Bully, but it might be just because of how competitive the deck can be, and not because it's fun.
Could you tell me about the Oops All Instants list that you recently won a league with?
Oops All Instants is a deck that already existed. The deck made some very spread results in challenges, something like once per year. I remember that the last build used to play a 4-mana 2/3 fairy that has flash and flying, and quicksand to kill ninja of the deep hours. So basically the deck wasn't so good before. And this week I was seeing this new mono blue delver build using Mystic Sanctuary, and then I remembered that the first version of the deck used to have only 4 Spellstutter Sprite and 4 Spire Golem, and I connected that with the fact that Mystic Sanctuary is an island and it synergizes well with Spire Golem, so then I could play the exact same creature structure as the first version of the deck. And also I could use Tragic Lesson and Deprive, filling the role of 2-card category the deck used to play, that is card draw and hard counters, that before Mystic Sanctuary was filled with Think Twice and Rune Snag. The deck really surprised me because the first league I played, I 5-0'd with it, and I was very happy about it. And maybe this strategy has the potential to be competitive in Pauper, but I'm not so sure about it.
Now, it occurs to me that very early in your introduction, you mentioned Magic Matters. Could you tell me more about your content?
The content of my channel is mostly about Pauper. I do MTGO gameplays, tabletop gameplays, deck techs, metagame analysis, and recently I started to do vlogs that try to help people to get better at Magic. And I try to mix competitive content with something more casual because I'm a player with these two sides. Sometimes I want to be competitive, and other times I just want to have some fun. The content is all in Portuguese, but it can be a place to check Pauper builds because I usually start my gameplays with a deck tech.
Since this isn't our traditional podcast, neither one of us has played a tournament for us to discuss a play of the day. Skipping that segment, let's move into the Silly Slivers abilities this week. Do you have a silly ability for Slivers to share?
There's a card from Unstable called Hoisted Hireling that has flying as long as it's being held above the battlefield. And I think that would be really funny as a sliver ability.
Yeah, that's pretty silly, and I think that's also a pretty fair ability, as all humans have only 2 hands. I guess some humans have less than 2 hands, but, generally speaking, all humans have 2 hands or less. So that would mean that you can only really have 2 silly slivers out in play at any one time if you need to be holding them up in order to use their abilities. My ability this week? All slivers have been binge watching their favorite television program, which is, of course, Golden Girls, and there's a lot of it for them to enjoy. That is all I have this week for you. I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and illuminating those of us who live outside of Brazil about how Brazilian Nationals works and giving us the insights into your wins. I wish you the most speedy of recoveries from your surgery.
Thank you a lot for having me in the podcast. I am a fan and I have listened to most of the episodes, so keep up the great work with the channel and with the podcast.
I found this to be a very interesting episode, not just because of the remote interview aspect, but because I learned so much more about the most prestigious Pauper event in the world and what makes it so prestigious. You can't just show up and play. It's not like Paupergeddon. I intend to travel to Italy in the summer and play Paupergeddon just because I just really have to show up in order to participate. Brazilian Nationals, I would have to win an event at a local game store and then show up using that invitation. That's a 2-step process, and it really narrows the field, which, considering they have over 100 players every year, it really speaks volumes to how healthy, stable, and engaging Pauper is in the Brazilian Magic community. Coming up on the podcast, we're going to speak to another Brazilian. We're going to speak to this year's champion. It's an interview that's going to take a while, as he doesn't speak any English. My goal is to release it while it's still 2019. End the year on that note. And then we're going to be on a short break for a while as I prepare for the Format Championship, which happens January 12th. Between the distractions of the holidays, the distractions of Vintage Cube, playtesting is already taking a back seat for me in my life, and unfortunately, I need to shelve the podcast until after the event, but we will return in January. I already have a very exciting interview lined up for that with who has become the most popular content creator in Pauper. After that, we're also going to talk to people that did well in the Format Championship. I'm going to do my very best to speak with the entire top 4 because there's not another Format Championship for the 2020 season. This is the last one we're getting for this foreseeable future. So I want to take time and make sure that those voices can truly be heard. Because like Brazilian Nationals, the Format Championship is not an open event. It's something that you have to qualify for, and only 40 players in the world have earned that distinction. So let's hear from the ones that rose to the very top. That's my roadmap for the future, and I'll see you then.